The first time I saw her, she was smiling, but there was no joy in it. Her lips were stretched too wide, her jaw moving slightly out of rhythm with the rest of her face, as if the smile had been practiced in front of a mirror for too long. I remember thinking, very clearly, that if I kept looking at her, something irreversible would happen. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. My name is Marko Petrovic. I'm telling this story years later, from an apartment far away from where it happened, but there are nights when I still smell wet asphalt and hear the faint scrape of shoes against concrete. This happened in October of 2016, in a quiet residential part of Zemun on the outskirts of Belgrade. At the time, I was 29 years old, working night shifts as a delivery driver for a small pharmacy. My life was painfully ordinary. I lived alone, slept during the day, worked through the night, and kept my head down. I wasn't superstitious. I didn't believe in urban legends. I believed in routines, because routines felt safe. That night started like any other. It was a Wednesday, just after 1 a.m. Cold enough that my breath fogged the windshield when I stopped at red lights. The streets were mostly empty, the kind of emptiness you only get in cities that have learnt to sleep deeply. Orange streetlights reflected off damp pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then went quiet. I remember feeling calm, even bored, as I turned onto a narrow side street I'd driven down hundreds of times before. That's when I saw movement near the far end of the road. At first, I thought it was someone stretching, maybe drunk, maybe waiting for a ride. A lone woman stood beneath a flickering streetlight, her back partially turned toward me. She was wearing a light-colored dress that looked completely wrong for the weather-themed fabric, clinging too closely to her body. Her arms were raised slightly, bent at odd angles, and her feet were moving. She wasn't walking. She was dancing, not gracefully, not to music. Her movements were stiff, jerky, like each limb was being pulled by a different invisible string. Her head tilted sharply to one side, then snapped back into place. I slowed the car without realizing it, my foot easing off the gas. A strange pressure settled behind my eyes, the kind you get when you're staring at something that doesn't make sense. This is where everything changed. As my headlights reached her, the streetlight above her flickered once, twice, and went out completely. For half a second, she disappeared into darkness. My heart jumped. Then the light came back on. She was facing me now. I should have looked away. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn my head, to focus on the road, to drive past and never think about it again. But I didn't. I made eye contact. Her eyes were wide open, unblinking, reflecting the headlights like glass. Her smile stretched even wider, and her movements became faster, sharper. Her feet scraped against the pavement in short, violent motions, producing a sound I can still hear if the room is quiet enough. Scrape, drag, scrape. I rolled down my window slightly and asked if she needed help. My voice sounded thin, distant, like it didn't belong to me. She didn't answer. She just kept dancing, her shoulders rolling unnaturally, her arms swinging too far back, as if her joints were loose. Then she took one step toward my car. I locked the doors. I don't remember consciously deciding to do it. My hands just moved. The click of the locks echoed too loudly inside the car. Her head tilted again, slow this time, deliberate. Her smile faltered for just a moment, long enough for me to see something else underneath it. Anger or hunger. I'm not sure which. I drove away. I told myself it was nothing. A drunk woman, someone mentally ill. Belgrade has its share of both, especially at night. But as I checked my rearview mirror, I saw her again still under the streetlight. Still dancing, but now facing away from me. Her movements slower, more controlled, like she was conserving energy. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. The rest of my shift passed without incident, but the feeling stayed with me. A sense of being watched, followed, evaluated. When I finally got home around 4:30 a.m., I double-checked the locks on my door. I stood at my window for a long time, looking down at the empty street below. Everything looked normal. Too normal. I went to bed telling myself I'd imagined the worst parts. The next night, I took a different route, and she was there too. Different street, same dancing, same dress, same smile. This time, she stood closer to my car, close enough that I could see the veins in her neck standing out with each sharp movement. The streetlight above her flickered again, and I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I kept my eyes forward, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. As I passed her, I heard a knock, not on the window, on the roof of my car. One single, deliberate tap. I almost crashed. I didn't sleep that day, or the next. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her smile, frozen in the moment our eyes met. I started asking around quietly. Other drivers, night workers, an old man at the bakery who'd been in the neighborhood longer than anyone else. That's when someone finally said the words I'd been trying not to think. The dancing lady. They spoke about her in hushed tones, like saying her name too loudly might summon her. A woman who appeared at night, always alone, always dancing under streetlights. The story was always the same. If you watched her too long, if you made eye contact, she would follow you. Not right away, not obviously. She would wait until you were alone, until you were vulnerable. I laughed it off in front of them. But inside, something cold settled into my chest, because she had already followed me home. I realized it on the third night, when I heard footsteps outside my apartment door at exactly 3:17 a.m. Slow, rhythmic, scraping slightly, like shoes being dragged across concrete. Scrape, pause, scrape. I held my breath. Standing in the dark hallway, my phone clutched uselessly in my hand. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I could feel her presence on the other side, so strong it made my skin prickle. Then I heard it dancing, muted but unmistakable. The soft thud of movement, the faint rustle of fabric, and beneath it all, the quiet, labored breathing of someone smiling too hard for too long. I didn't open the door. I stayed perfectly still until the sounds faded with the coming dawn. She never knocked. She didn't need to. I moved out of that apartment a week later. Changed jobs, changed routes. Eventually, I left the city entirely. I thought distance would help. That time would dull the memory. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night and a streetlight flickers, I feel that familiar pressure behind my eyes. And I know deep down that if I ever look again, really look, she'll dance for me one last time. I didn't notice the dancing at first. What I noticed was how quiet everything felt, like the city had paused to watch me make a mistake. The air was cold and still, and even the usual hum of traffic was gone. I remember thinking that if I stayed where I was just a few seconds longer, something would acknowledge me. I didn't understand that feeling then, but I do now. My name is Nikola Jovanovi. This happened in February of 2014, during one of the harshest winters I can remember in Novi Sad. I was 32 at the time, recently divorced, working as an overnight maintenance technician for the city's electrical department. My shifts ended just after midnight, and because my car had broken down that week, I took the last bus home every night. It was a dull routine, lonely but predictable. I liked it that way. Predictability felt like control. That night, my shift ended at 12:47 a.m. I remember the exact time because the digital clock inside the maintenance building was broken and always ran 3 minutes fast. Outside, snow clung to the sidewalks in uneven grey piles, and the wind carried the metallic smell of ice and old power lines. I zipped my jacket up to my chin and walked the 4 blocks to the bus stop near an abandoned textile factory. The bus stop was poorly lit, just a metal bench and a narrow shelter with cracked glass walls. One streetlight flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows across the snow. There was already someone there, a woman standing near the edge of the sidewalk, her back to me. At first I assumed she was waiting for the same bus. She was wearing a thin dress, pale in color, and flat shoes completely unsuited for the snow. Her dark hair hung loose down her back, unmoving despite the wind. I remember thinking it was strange she wasn't shivering. I nodded politely when I stepped into the shelter, but she didn't turn around. That's when I noticed her feet. They were moving, not stepping, not pacing, sliding back and forth in small, repetitive motions, barely lifting off the ground. Her arms were raised slightly away from her body, elbows bent, fingers twitching in tight, controlled gestures. It looked like the beginning of a dance if you stripped all the music and grace out of it. This is where everything started to feel wrong. I cleared my throat and glanced at my phone, pretending not to stare. The bus was due in 6 minutes. The cold seeped through my boots, numbing my toes. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her head tilt to one side, slow and deliberate, as if she'd heard my thoughts instead of my movement. The street light flickered. When it steadied again, she was closer. I hadn't heard her move. She turned toward me, and my stomach dropped. Her face was expressionless, except for her mouth, which was pulled into a tight, unnatural smile. Her eyes locked onto mine immediately, wide and glassy, reflecting the streetlight like polished stone. I felt frozen. Not scared, not yet, but trapped in a moment that felt heavier than it should have. Her feet continued their subtle dance, scraping softly against the icy pavement. Scrape, slide, scrape. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. Is the bus late? I asked, my voice cracking despite my effort to keep it calm. She didn't answer. Instead, her movements grew more pronounced. Her shoulders rolled forward and back in stiff, mechanical motions. Her arms swung wider, her fingers curling and uncurling, like she was grasping something invisible. The scraping sound grew louder, sharper, echoing inside my head. The streetlight flickered again and went out. For a full second, everything went black. When the light came back on, she was right in front of me. Too close, I stumbled backward, hitting the glass wall of the shelter. She leaned forward slightly, her smile widening as if she'd been waiting for that reaction. I could smell her now, a faint, sour scent, like damp fabric left too long in a closed space. That's when I noticed her eyes weren't blinking, not once. The bus headlights appeared in the distance, and relief surged through me so fast it made me dizzy. The woman turned her head slowly toward the approaching light, then back to me. Her smile twitched, faltering just for a moment. She took one step back, then she began to dance in earnest. Her movements became violent, erratic, her limbs jerking at unnatural angles. Her feet struck the ground harder now, the scraping replaced by sharp, deliberate stomps that sent cracks through the thin layer of ice. The sound was unbearable, like bones knocking together. The bus pulled up, doors hissing. Open. I didn't look at her again. I couldn't. I rushed past her and climbed aboard, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. As the bus pulled away, I glanced out the window despite myself. She stood alone at the bus stop, dancing beneath the dead streetlight, her movements slow once more, controlled. As the distance grew, she raised one hand and pointed not at the bus, but directly at me. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that stare pressing against my skull. I started noticing small things scraping, sounds outside my apartment at night, faint rhythmic movements reflected in dark windows. Once, while brushing my teeth, I thought I saw her standing behind me in the mirror, her smile just visible over my shoulder. When I spun around, there was nothing there. I asked around at work, carefully at first. One of the older electricians went pale when I described her. He told me, in a low voice, about an old story from the Regina woman who appeared at night, dancing alone near roads and bus stops. They said she chose people who noticed her, people who acknowledged her presence. If she makes eye contact, he said, she remembers you. That night, I stayed with a friend. The night after that, I stayed at a hotel. But on the third night, no matter where I went, I heard the same sound outside around 3 a.m. Scrape, slide, scrape. I realized then that distance didn't matter. Movement didn't matter. She wasn't following my body, she was following my attention. I moved out of Novi Sad within a month. New job, new city, new routines. Years have passed since then, but sometimes when I'm waiting alone at night and the streetlights flicker, I feel that familiar stillness settle around me, and I know she's nearby, waiting for me to look again. I was folding laundry when I first heard the sound, soft, rhythmic, almost polite. At the time, it blended so easily into the background of my routine that I didn't question it. That's the part that still scares me the most. Not the dancing. Not the smile. The fact that I heard something wrong and chose to ignore it. My name is Stefanili. This happened in April of 2019 in a small town near Kragujevac, Serbia. I was 36 years old, recently remarried, living with my wife and her 80-year-old daughter in a modest 2-story house at the edge of a quiet residential street. I worked as an inventory supervisor at a furniture warehouse. Long days, predictable stress. My evenings were simple. Dinner, light cleaning, preparing for the next day. I valued routine because routine meant nothing unexpected could slip in. That night was no different. It was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were laundry nights. My wife had gone to bed early with a headache, and her daughter was asleep in the next room. The house was quiet in that comfortable way that only comes when everyone is where they're supposed to be. Outside, the air smelled like damp soil and early spring blossoms. A light rain had fallen earlier, leaving the ground dark and soft. I stood in the bedroom, folding shirts under the warm yellow glow of a bedside lamp. That's when I heard it. A faint scraping sound, slow, repetitive at first. I assumed it was a tree branch brushing against the side of the house. We had an old plum tree near the fence, and when the wind picked up, it sometimes made noises that carried strangely at night. I finished folding, stacked the clothes neatly, and turned off the lamp. The sound continued. Scrape, pause. Scrape. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. I moved toward the window and peeked through the thin gap in the curtains. The backyard was dim, illuminated only by a weak security light attached to the garage. The wet grass reflected just enough light to make shadows stretch unnaturally long. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then something moved. A woman stood near the fence, just beyond the reach of the light. She was facing sideways, her body partially turned toward the house. She wore a pale dress that clung to her frame, its hem darkened with moisture. Her feet were bare, planted directly on the wet ground, and she was dancing. Not fully. Not yet. Her movements were restrained, controlled small shifts of weight, subtle turns of her shoulders, arms raised slightly as if waiting for music only she could hear. Her feet dragged softly across the earth, producing the scraping sound I'd heard inside the house. I felt a tightening in my chest, an instinctive warning that came too late. I should have closed the curtain. Instead, I watched. This is where everything began to unravel. Her head turned slowly, unnaturally far, until her face was angled directly toward my window. Even from that distance, I could see her smile. It wasn't wide. It wasn't exaggerated. It was precise, deliberate, as if she'd practiced it carefully. Our eyes met. The moment stretched, thick and heavy. The sounds of the night faded, the insects, the distant hum of traffic. All I could hear was my own breathing and the soft scrape of her feet. Against the ground, she took one step closer to the house. I stepped back from the window, my heart hammering. Logic rushed in, desperate and clumsy. Maybe she was drunk. Maybe she was mentally ill. Maybe she was lost. But none of those explanations fit the way my skin prickled, or the sudden certainty that acknowledging her had been a mistake. I closed the curtain. The scraping didn't stop. It grew louder. I moved quietly to the bedroom door and listened. The house remained still. No footsteps, no voices. My wife and stepdaughter slept on, unaware. I told myself I'd imagined the worst part, that if I checked again, she would be gone. When I looked back out the window, she was closer, close enough that I could see the dirt smeared across her feet, close enough that I could hear her breathing slow, controlled, timed perfectly with her movements. Her arms moved more freely now, swinging wider, her shoulders rolling with stiff precision. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. I locked the window. That's when the security light flickered. It dimmed, brightened, then went out entirely. For several seconds, the backyard was swallowed by darkness. I stood frozen, staring at my own reflection in the glass. When the light came back on, she was standing directly beneath my window, her face tilted upward, her smile wider now, strained. Her eyes were open too wide, unblinking, fixed on mine even though I'd tried to step back. She raised one hand slowly and pressed her palm against the glass. It was cold. I felt it through the window. I stumbled away, nearly tripping over the bed. My pulse roared in my ears. I grabbed my phone and considered calling the police, but something stopped me. A deep, irrational certainty that by speaking about her, by giving her attention, I would make things worse. Outside, she began to dance. In earnest, the movements were wrong, violent. Her limbs jerked sharply, bending at angles that made my stomach churn. Her feet struck the ground harder now, the scraping replaced by dull, wet impacts. Thud, drag, thud. The sound carried through the walls. My wife stirred, murmuring in her sleep. Panic flooded me. I couldn't let her see this. I couldn't let the child wake up. I crept into the hallway and listened at the front door. That's when I heard it. The scraping sound again. This time, from the front of the house. My breath caught. There was no way she could move that fast. No path from the backyard to the front door without passing several motion lights, and yet there it was. Scrape, pause, scrape. I stood in the dark hallway, paralyzed. As the sound stopped directly outside the front door, silence followed. Then a gentle knock, once, twice, perfectly spaced. I didn't answer. Minutes passed. Or hours. Time lost meaning. Eventually, the knocking stopped. The scraping faded. Dawn crept into the house, soft and grey. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, there was nothing there. No footprints, no marks, no sign anyone had been standing barefoot in the wet soil. I didn't sleep the next night, or the night after that. I began to notice things, subtle movements in reflective surfaces, faint scraping sounds when the house was quiet. Sometimes, when I woke in the middle of the night, I was certain someone was standing just outside the bedroom door, breathing slowly, rhythmically. I asked an elderly neighbor about it, careful not to give too many details. She crossed herself immediately and told me, in a trembling voice, about a woman people used to see dancing alone at night. A warning, she said. A test. If she knows you've seen her, the neighbor whispered, she won't leave. We moved out within 2 months. Newtown, new house, new routines, but sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and I'm doing something ordinary, folding laundry, washing dishes, I hear it again, scrape, pause, scrape, and I know she's still dancing, waiting for me to look. I was halfway through my shift report when I realized the camera feed hadn't frozen, it was moving on its own. That was the moment I understood something was wrong, even before I saw her, even before I recognized the rhythm. I didn't understand what that movement meant then, but I do now. My name is Luca Milesi. In the winter of 2018, I worked nights as a private security guard at a small logistics warehouse on the outskirts of Niš. It wasn't an important job, mostly boredom, fluorescent lights, and the hum of aging monitors. My shift ran from 10 o'clock p.m. to 6 a.m., and I was usually alone except for a radio that barely worked and a thermos of coffee that went cold too fast. I liked the quiet. Nothing unexpected ever happened there. Or so I thought. That night was a Thursday. I remember because Thursdays were inventory delivery nights, which meant extra paperwork and double-checking locks after midnight. Outside, the temperature had dropped below freezing. Frost coated the empty parking lot, and the air smelled faintly of oil and wet concrete. The building itself was a squat, rectangular structure with no windows on 3 sides and a single loading bay. In the back, inside, the security office was a narrow room with peeling paint and 6 surveillance monitors mounted above a metal desk. At 1:47 a.m., everything was normal. At 2:11 a.m., one of the cameras shifted. At first I assumed it was a technical glitch. The cameras were old, prone to flickering and slight delays. I leaned back in my chair, sipping lukewarm coffee, watching the feed from camera 3, though one pointed at the far end of the parking lot near the chain link fence. That's when I noticed the movement wasn't random. It was rhythmic. A figure stood near the fence, partially illuminated by a single malfunctioning floodlight. The light pulsed weakly, casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. The figure was a woman, standing unnaturally still except for her feet. They were moving, sliding back and forth in short, deliberate motions. Scrape, pause, scrape. I felt a slow tightening in my chest. I zoomed in. She wore a light-colored dress, thin and out of place for the cold. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, barely stirring in the wind. Her arms were raised slightly, elbows bent, fingers flexing as if she were testing the air. She was dancing. This is where my routine stopped protecting me. I leaned closer to the screen, squinting. The image quality was poor, grainy, but I could make out her face when she turned slightly toward the camera. She was smiling, not broadly, not warmly, just enough to suggest intention. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. I checked the timestamp again. 2:11 a.m., the same time the older guard had once told me never to ignore, half joking, half serious. I remembered laughing it off back. Then, I reached for the radio and called out to the empty building, my voice echoing faintly through the hallways. No response. The sound of my own voice made the room feel smaller, more fragile. On the screen, she took one step closer to the camera. The floodlight flickered. For a second, the feed went dark. When it returned, she was closer still. My skin prickled. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor. The sound startled me more than it should have. I told myself I needed to check it in person. That was my job. Cameras could lie. Eyes couldn't. I grabbed my jacket and flashlight and stepped into the corridor. The building smelled like dust and cold metal. Each step echoed too loudly. As I reached the back door leading to the parking lot, I hesitated. The scraping sound carried through the metal. Soft, measured, scrape. Pause. Scrape. I froze with my hand on the door handle. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. Against every instinct I had, I opened the door. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and biting. The parking lot stretched out, empty, frost glistening under the weak floodlights. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then I saw her. She stood exactly where the camera had shown her, near the fence, her body angled slightly away from me. Her feet continued their slow dance across the frozen ground, leaving faint marks in the frost. She didn't look cold. She didn't shiver. I cleared my throat and asked if she was lost. She didn't answer. Instead, her movements changed. Her shoulders began to roll, stiff and mechanical. Her arms swung wider, fingers curling and uncurling like she was grasping something invisible. The scraping of her feet grew louder, harsher against the frozen surface. I took a step back. She turned her head. Our eyes met. The smile widened, just enough to make my stomach turn. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, reflecting the floodlight like dull glass. I felt something settle into my chest, then a certainty that I had been noticed in a way that couldn't be undone. The floodlight flickered again. When it steadied, she was closer. I backed away slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The beam danced across her face, and for a split second her smile dropped. What replaced it wasn't anger. It was anticipation. I retreated inside and slammed the door, locking it with hands that didn't feel like mine. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out. I rushed back to the security office and stared at the monitors. Camera 3 was static now, but camera 1, the one pointed at the front entrance, showed movement. She was there too, standing beneath the entrance light, dancing. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. Every camera showed her, one by one, as if she were moving faster than the system could track. Back entrance, side lot, loading bay, always dancing, always smiling, always facing the camera at 2:23 a.m. All the monitors went black. The building fell into silence. Then I heard it from inside. Scrape. Scrape. The sound echoed through the hallway outside the security office. My breath caught in my throat. The handle on the office door rattled once, gently, almost politely. I didn't move. The handle rattled again. Then the sound of movement, slow, deliberate, circling the door. Fabric brushing against metal. Soft, controlled breathing. I stayed frozen until dawn. When the morning shift arrived at 6 a.m., they found me still sitting in the chair, staring at dead monitors. The footage from that night was gone, corrupted. They said, no trace of anyone entering the property. I quit that day. I don't work nights anymore. I avoid security cameras. I avoid places where lights flicker and routines feel too safe. But sometimes, when I pass a building late at night and see a lone camera pointed at an empty space, I wonder if she's still there, dancing just outside the frame, waiting for someone else to notice. I was washing my hands for the 3rd time when I noticed the security mirror above the sink wasn't reflecting me the way it should have. Something in the background was moving out of rhythm with the rest of the world, slow and deliberate, like it had all the time it needed. That was the moment my routine stopped feeling safe. My name is Annika Vevik. In the summer of 2020, I worked nights as a cleaning assistant at a regional hospital in central Serbia, not far from Wozak. I was 28 years old, newly transferred to the night shift because it paid slightly more and came with fewer supervisors watching over my shoulder. I told myself I preferred the quiet. The truth was, I needed the money. Hospitals at night have a specific atmosphere, muted, controlled, almost sacred. The air smells of disinfectant and metal. Every sound feels amplified because nothing is supposed to happen. My shift began at 11 p.m. sharp. By midnight, most of the lights were dimmed, leaving only the soft glow of emergency bulbs lining the corridors. The building was old, with long, narrow hallways that curved just enough to block your view of what waited around the corner. My routine never changed. I started on the 3rd floor, moved down methodically, room by room, corridor by corridor. Predictability was my shield. At 1:38 a.m., I was assigned to clean the unused wing of the 2nd floor. No patients, no staff. Just empty rooms and the hum of ventilation systems pushing cold air through forgotten spaces. I remember checking my phone for the time because my hands had started to shake for no obvious reason. That's when I heard it, a soft scraping sound. At first, I assumed it was one of the supply carts rolling in the distance, or maybe a nurse dragging a chair across the floor. Hospitals are full of noises you learn to ignore. I continued wiping down door handles, the disinfectant stinging my nose. The sound came again. Scrape, pause, scrape. I froze. It was too slow, too intentional. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. I peered down the corridor. The emergency lights cast long, sterile shadows that stretched and twisted along the walls. At the far end, near the fire exit, a woman stood beneath a flickering light. She was wearing a pale dress, not a gown, not scrubs. A dress that looked thin and out of place in the chilled hospital air. Her feet were bare, pressing flat against the polished floor. Her arms were raised slightly, elbows bent, fingers flexing as if she were preparing for something. She was dancing, not fully, just enough to be unmistakable. My stomach tightened. I took a cautious step backward, my cleaning cart bumping softly into the wall. The woman's head tilted sharply to one side, like she'd heard the sound through the building itself. The light above her flickered. When it steadied, she was closer. I backed into the nearest patient room and closed the door quietly, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. I turned off the light and stood in the darkness, holding my breath. Outside, the scraping continued. Scrape, pause, scrape. The sound moved past the door, slow and deliberate. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. The smell of disinfectant burned my lungs. After several minutes, the sound faded. I waited longer than I should have before stepping back into the corridor. It was empty. The emergency lights hummed softly. No sign of anyone else. I told myself stress was playing tricks on me. Night shifts did that. Hospitals magnified fear. I pushed my cart forward. At the end of the corridor, near the stairwell, I saw her again. This time, she was facing me. Her smile was small, controlled, as if she'd learnt it from watching people instead of feeling it. Her eyes locked onto mine immediately, wide and reflective. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. She took one step toward me. I turned and ran. My shoes squeaked loudly against the floor as I sprinted down the corridor. My cart abandoned. Behind me, I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ducked into another wing, then another, my lungs burning. I stopped near a nurse's station, gasping for breath. No one was there. The clock on the wall read to 11 a.m. The lights flickered behind me, reflected in the darkened monitor. Screen, I saw movement. She stood at the far end of the corridor, dancing beneath the emergency light. I screamed. The sound echoed, thin and useless. She didn't react. She just kept dancing, her movements growing sharper, more erratic. Her bare feet slapped softly against the floor now, replacing the scrape with a wet, hollow sound. I backed away until I hit the wall. Tears streamed down my face. I begged her to stop, my voice shaking. She stepped forward, and then she vanished. The light steadied. The corridor was empty. Security arrived minutes later. After hearing my scream over the radio, they searched the floor, found nothing. No footprints, no camera footage. The cameras in that wing had stopped recording at 2:11 a.m. I was sent home early. I never returned to night shifts. Years have passed, but hospitals still make my skin crawl. Sometimes, when I'm in a quiet corridor or washing my hands late at night, I catch my reflection moving a fraction of a second too late, and I remember the scraping sound, slow, patient, still following me. I was counting coins for the third time when I realized the pile wasn't changing. The numbers stayed the same no matter how carefully I stacked them, like the night itself had stalled. That's when I heard the scraping sound outside the booth. Steady and patient, and understood my routine had finally run out of protection. My name is Milan Ristic. This happened in November of 2017, on a regional highway outside Smederevo, where I worked the night shift at a toll booth that most drivers barely remembered existed. I was 34 years old then, married, with a newborn at home and a job that paid just enough to keep us afloat. The booth was small plexiglass windows on 3 sides, a narrow door at the back, a heater that rattled more than it warmed. My shift ran from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m., and after midnight, traffic thinned to almost nothing. That was why I liked it. Nothing happened after midnight. Trucks passed every half hour, sometimes less. The rest of the time, there was just the hum of distant engines, the smell of oil and wet asphalt, and the dull glow of sodium lights reflecting off the road. I kept myself busy with routine counting coins, logging plates, wiping down the counter. Predictability kept the fear away. At 1:58 a.m. the last car passed through at 2:11 a.m. I heard movement outside. At first I assumed it was an animal. Stray dogs sometimes wandered near the booths, drawn by warmth or scraps. I leaned forward and peered through the front window. The highway stretched out, empty in both directions, lanes slick with mist. The fog was thick enough that the lights created halos, making distance hard to judge. Then I saw her. She stood just beyond the painted stop line, beneath a flickering overhead lamp. A woman, alone, facing sideways to the booth. She wore a light dress that fluttered slightly in the cold air, completely wrong for the season. Her feet were bare on the asphalt. They were moving, sliding in short, Controlled motions. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. My stomach tightened. People didn't walk here. There was no pedestrian access for kilometers. I rolled down the window a few centimeters and called out, asking if she needed help. She didn't answer. Instead, her movements became more deliberate. Her arms lifted slightly, elbows bent, fingers curling as if she were feeling the air. It looked like the beginning of a dance stripped of music and joy. Just motion. Just intent. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. The overhead lamp flickered, buzzing loudly. When it steadied, she was closer, not by walking, just closer. The distance between us had shrunk without any movement I could recall seeing. I locked the window. The heater rattled. The booth suddenly felt too small. I reached for the radio to call the control center, but before I could press the button, the scraping sound grew louder, sharper against the asphalt. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. She turned her head. Our eyes met through the glass. Her smile was subtle, precise, like it had been measured carefully. Her eyes were wide, reflective, unblinking. I felt something settle deep in my chest, a certainty that I'd been noticed in a way that couldn't be undone. She stepped forward, stopping inches from the booth window. I could see the dirt on her feet, the faint tremor in her hands. I could smell damp fabric and cold air even through the sealed glass. She raised one hand slowly and pressed it against the window. The glass fogged beneath her palm. I stumbled back, knocking over the coin tray. Coins scattered across the floor, ringing too loudly in the confined space. When I looked back up, she was gone. For a moment, relief flooded me so hard my knees weakened. Then I heard it again. Behind the booth, scrape. Pause. Scrape. My heart slammed against my ribs. There was no way around to the back without passing directly. Beside the booth. No one could be there unless they'd moved impossibly fast. I held my breath, listening as the sound circled the structure slowly, deliberately, like she was tracing it. The back door handle rattled once. Gently, I didn't move. The handle rattled again. Then nothing. Silence stretched, thick and oppressive. Minutes passed, or seconds. Time felt wrong. When the sound finally faded, I sank into the chair, shaking. I reported nothing when my shift ended. I told myself exhaustion had played tricks on me. New baby, night work, stress. But the next night, she was there again. Same time, same lamp, same dance. This time, I didn't look for long. I kept my eyes down, focused on the counter, on the numbers that refused to make sense. But I felt her attention like pressure. Against my skull, the lamp flickered. The scraping grew louder. I understood then that looking wasn't the only way to be seen. On the third night, she didn't appear outside at all. I thought maybe it was over. At 2:11 a.m., the booth lights went out. In the darkness, I heard her breathing slow, controlled right behind me. I quit the next morning. I don't drive highways at night anymore. I avoid toll roads. But sometimes, when I'm stopped at a red light and everything goes quiet, I feel that familiar stillness settle in, and I know she's still waiting, just beyond the line. I was already reaching for my keys when the radio crackled and my dispatcher said my name one last time. Her voice hesitated just slightly before giving me the address. That hesitation stayed with me longer than anything else. Longer than the dancing, longer than the smile. Because some part of her already knew what that call meant to Vin, if I didn't yet. My name is Dejan Markovic. In March of 2015, I worked nights as an emergency utility technician in southern Serbia, mostly responding to after-hours power and gas complaints. I was 39 years old, divorced, living alone in a rented house on the edge of town. Night work suited me. Less traffic, fewer people, fewer conversations. I liked fixing problems in silence and then leaving before anyone asked questions. That night had been slow, unusually slow. No storms, no outages, just routine maintenance checks and a couple of false alarms. By 1:50 a.m., I was already thinking about heading back to the depot to finish paperwork and clock out early. That's when the call came in. Possible power fluctuation, the dispatcher said. Residential street. Caller reports, lights flickering and movement. She paused before that last word. I didn't ask for clarification. I never did. You learn quickly on night shifts that asking questions just makes people uncomfortable. I wrote down the address and drove. The street was narrow, lined with old single-story houses and leafless trees that rattled softly in the cold wind. Sodium streetlights cast a dull orange glow, uneven and unreliable. The air smelled like damp soil and aging wood. I parked my van near the address and stepped out, pulling my jacket tighter around me. Everything looked quiet. Too quiet. The house in question sat near the end of the street, its porch light flickering weakly. I walked up the driveway, toolbox in hand, and knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder. Still nothing. I checked the meter on the side of the house. It hummed faintly, irregularly, like it was struggling to stay awake. That's when I noticed the sound. Scrape, pause, scrape. It came from further. Down the street, beyond the reach of the porch light. I turned slowly, my breath fogging in the air. A woman stood beneath a flickering streetlight. She wore a pale dress, thin and out of place for the cold night. Her feet were bare on the asphalt. Her arms were raised slightly, elbows bent, fingers flexing with small, precise movements. She was dancing, not fully, just enough to be unmistakable. I felt a tightening behind my eyes, a pressure that made me want to look away and look harder. At the same time, I told myself she was drunk, or lost, or someone's relative who wandered out of the house. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. I cleared my throat and called out, asking if she needed help. My voice echoed strangely down the empty street. She didn't answer. Her feet continued their slow movement. Scrape, pause, scrape. The streetlight above her flickered violently, buzzing. When it steadied, she was closer. I hadn't seen her move. I took a step back, my boot crunching softly on gravel. Her head tilted sharply to one side, her smile appearing like it had been switched on, controlled, measured. Her eyes locked onto mine immediately, wide and unblinking. That was the mistake. The moment stretched, heavy and silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then her movements changed. Her arms swung wider, shoulders rolling with stiff precision. The scraping of her feet grew louder, sharper against the pavement. I backed toward my van without turning my back on her. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. She followed, but not by walking. The distance between us simply closed. I reached the driver's door and fumbled with my keys, dropping them once before grabbing them again. When I looked up, she was standing directly in front of the van, inches from the headlights. She placed her hand on the hood. The metal creaked softly. I jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the door, locking it immediately. The engine sputtered before turning over. My hand shook so badly I nearly stalled, pulling away. As I drove, I checked the mirrors. She stood in the middle of the road, dancing beneath the streetlight, her movements slowing as I put distance between us. When I reached the corner and turned, I felt a wave of relief so strong it made me lightheaded. I didn't understand it then, but I do now, I reported. Nothing when I returned to the depot. Just marked the call as no access, possible wiring issue. I went home and didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her smile hovering in the darkness. The next night, my dispatcher assigned me another late call. Different address. Same street. I told her I couldn't take it. Claimed I was sick. She didn't argue. That should have been the end of it. But at 2:11 a.m., I heard scraping outside my house. Slow, rhythmic. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. I stood frozen in my hallway, listening as the sound moved along the front of the house. The porch light flickered on by itself. I didn't look out there. Window, I didn't open the door. The sound lingered for several minutes before fading with the approach of dawn. I quit my job that week. Years have passed since then. I work days now. I avoid night calls, avoid empty streets, avoid flickering lights. But sometimes, when I'm driving home late and the radio crackles unexpectedly, I feel that familiar pressure behind my eyes. And I know that if I ever answer one last call after midnight, she'll already be waiting. I was wiping fingerprints off the lobby doors when I realized the reflection behind me was moving out of sync with my hands. At first, I blamed exhaustion. Night work does that. It bends your sense of time, makes ordinary things feel slightly wrong. But the longer I watched, the clearer it became that whatever was moving behind me wasn't copying me at all. My name is Bojan Stankovic. This happened in September of 2021, in a newly built business complex on the outskirts of Belgrade. I was 42 years old and working nights as a contract cleaner for office buildings that never really slept, even when the people inside went home. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and most nights were identical empty floors, humming elevators, and the smell of glass cleaner lingering in the air. I liked the predictability. After years of chaos in my personal life, routine felt like something solid I could hold on to. That night started normally. I parked in the underground garage, rode the service elevator up to the lobby, and began my usual circuit. The building was all glass and steel floor 2 ceiling windows, polished stone floors, and mirrored walls that reflected everything twice over. Even small movements felt exaggerated in that space. By 1:30 a.m., I was alone on the ground floor, polishing the massive glass doors that faced the street. Outside, the business park was silent, illuminated by evenly spaced streetlights that cast long, pale reflections across the empty plaza. The air conditioning hummed softly behind the walls, a constant artificial breath. That's when I noticed the reflection at first. It looked like my own movement, lagging slightly behind. Nay, optical trick caused by fatigue and poor lighting. I wiped the glass again, slower this time, and watched carefully. My hands stopped. The reflection dinged behind me. In the glass, a woman stood near the edge of the plaza, just beyond the reach of the lobby lights. She was pale against the darkness, wearing a thin dress that caught the light in dull flashes. Her feet were bare on the concrete, and they were moving, sliding back and forth in small, deliberate motions. Scrape, pause, scrape. I felt a cold pressure settle behind my eyes. Slowly I turned around. The plaza was empty. No one stood. There, no movement. Just my breath fogging the glass slightly and the distant buzz of streetlights. I turned back to the door. She was still there in the reflection. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. Her movements were subtle, restrained, like she was conserving energy. Her arms were raised slightly, elbows bent, fingers flexing in tight, controlled gestures. It looked like the beginning of a dance that never quite reached its peak. I stepped back from the door. In the reflection, she stepped forward. My heart began to race. I told myself reflections could distort depth, could lie about distance. I moved sideways. She mirrored Mint exactly, but close enough to make my skin prickle. I turned fully away from the glass and faced the plaza again. Nothing when I turned back. She was closer in the reflection, close enough now that I could make out her face. Her smile was small and precise, like it had been practiced. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, fixed directly on mine through the glass. I backed away, bumping into my cleaning cart. The metal clanged softly, echoing in the vast lobby. The sound seemed to please her. Her smile widened just a fraction, and her movements grew sharper. The scraping sound wasn't just in my head anymore. I could hear it. Scrape, scrape. It echoed faintly through the lobby, out of sync with the reflection, but unmistakably real. I grabbed my phone and called the security desk. No answer. The signal bars flickered, then disappeared entirely. The lobby lights dimmed slightly, as if the building itself were conserving power. I didn't understand it then, but I do. Now, I backed toward the elevator bank, keeping my eyes off the glass as much as I could. Every reflective surface felt dangerous now, the walls, the polished floor, even the chrome trim on the doors. The elevator button lit up when I pressed it. Behind me, the scraping grew louder. I glanced down despite myself. In the reflection of the floor, I saw her feet moving closer, bare soles sliding across the stone. The reflection showed more of her now, her legs, her dress clinging unnaturally to her frame. The elevator dinged. I stepped inside and turned to face the doors, my chest tight with panic. As the doors began to close, I saw her clearly for the first time, not in reflection, but standing just outside the elevator, beneath the dim lobby lights. She was exactly where the reflection said she would be. Her movements were no longer restrained. Her limbs jerked sharply, bending at angles that made my stomach twist. Her feet struck the floor harder now, the scraping replaced by dull, rhythmic impacts. The doors closed, the elevator descended slowly, agonizingly slowly. I stared at my own reflection in the metal walls, half expectant to see her standing behind me. When the doors opened in the garage, everything looked normal. Concrete pillars, parked cars, fluorescent lights humming softly. I ran. I didn't bother cleaning the rest of the building. I drove home with my hands clenched tight around the steering wheel, checking the mirrors every few seconds. I didn't sleep. The next night, my supervisor called, asking why I hadn't finished the job. I told him I was sick. He didn't push. 2 nights later, I returned to collect my things from the supply closet. I told myself I'd imagined it. Stress, fatigue, night work. The lobby looked the same. As I stepped inside, the glass doors reflected me clearly, and her she stood behind. Me, closer than before, her smile wide now, her eyes fixed on mine. Her feet scraped softly against the floor in the reflection.
I
didn't turn around. I dropped my keys and ran out of the building, never looking back. I quit that job the next morning. Even now, years later, I avoid glass buildings at night. I avoid mirrors in dark rooms. But sometimes, when I catch my reflection in a window after midnight, I swear it moves just a fraction of a second too late. And I remember the scraping sound, slow, patient, waiting for me to notice again.